Morning, morning, morning. Yeah, as Malcolm said, thank you very much. As Malcolm said, if you do not have coffee yet, now would be the time to get it. If you fall asleep, I totally understand. It was probably a long night, late night for many of you. I'm going to be talking about product management in Bitcoin companies. Hopefully this is a bit of an overview. Think of it as a tasting menu, a little bit of a tapas. And so if you see something here interesting, it's something to explore later. Or just talk about more further through the week. So quickly, I do work at Swan Bitcoin, representing product there. I won't talk about that too much here. We can cover that later in coffee chats or anything else. But first, a little bit of a background. Why am I here? Someone asked me that the other day. I grew up in Indiana, which is in the Midwest, which is in the US. This is my grandpa. We were almost Amish. If you know anything about the US culture, we were almost, not quite. We did have cars, and we kind of wore normal clothes, but that was my grandpa. Early travels in India, Taiwan influenced kind of what I was about to do. Meanwhile, my future wife was growing up in Cambodia. Her family left during the war. They got to the US. We eventually met in DC, and so we eventually started moving around in different places of the world. I joined Microsoft in about 2006. That dates me a bit. We then lived in Ireland, eventually Vietnam. These are the kids that we were living here with at the time. We were in Hanoi for 2 years, Saigon for 3 years. And so that's just a bit of a backstory of why I'm here and why covering this at this conference. I love Vietnam. With that, after Microsoft, I left. That was about 2017. I left Microsoft, led a small AI startup with the tech team here based in Vietnam. We sold that company to Momo, which is a large fintech here in Vietnam, and then I got into Bitcoin, and so that's kind of how I ended up there. First, anyone who recognized this guy, this was in Hanoi in 2010. I was with Microsoft at the time. Really embarrassing thing, my claim to fame was having a demo fail right after him on stage. And for those who don't know, that's a former CEO of Microsoft. Today, what we're going to do, we're going to cover some things quickly. Most of it is making sure you all see some beautiful places of Vietnam. That's part of my goal, so that you come back and spend some more tourist dollars or sats here. Also, of course, product management is not real unless it has a lot of Venn diagrams. And so we will, of course, have some Venn diagrams today. So let's get on with it. If you have not been to the northern part of Vietnam, then this is, of course, something you should see during this time. And this is up in Sapa. Beautiful places, wonderful places to stay. Next up, if you like caving, the world's largest cave is in Vietnam. This is kind of here in the central area of Vietnam. Another great experience to come back to if you're into that. There's also adventures along the way. Saigon does flood at times, and so watch out for that one. And if you do have time while you're here, this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site just a few minutes south of here, about 15, 20 minutes south. Definitely worth seeing Hoi An while you're here. All right, so back to product management. If any of you work, let me just see a quick show of hands. Anyone identify as a product manager or work in product in any way? Anyone? Okay, great, awesome, thank you. You've had enough coffee. Anyone guilty of this one? Me. If you have a choice when you work in product, do you want to work on your tech debt or do you want to work on something new? And we always want to work on something new, and yet this is part of the tensions that we have through this process. So where is the Venn? This is probably the most classic Venn you will see about product management. Something here that's a connectedness of UX, kind of engineering or technology, and business is sort of how it's often said. And rightly so. Marissa talks about this really is that place between kind of the technology and business. I'll start off first, though, very quickly. This does not mean you need to have a title product or have a product management function at your company or within your project. It just means that this function needs to exist with someone. Sometimes that's a CEO, sometimes it's a CMO, it could be your sales lead, it could be your engineering lead. It just means that someone will probably start to exhibit these activities and these characteristics in your project or in your company. The single best way to think about product management that I've seen so far is this great old blog post. It's a few years old now. Really, product management as janitors. And so for anyone who thinks this is a glorified position, it's not. You literally, the best way you can do this job is to be a great janitor, which is really to do whatever is needed by the team to be effective in that period of time or in that period of the project, if that makes sense. And so we'll go through that a bit. So early stage, I've changed 2 words on here. This is how I think about it, that UX isn't really just about user experience. It's really about customer experience. And so if you're connected into a sales motion, if you're connected to a customer service motion, if you're connected to any support, other type of thing that connects to a customer, that's a holistic way to think about customer experience. And so of course the UX is part of that, but there's ways that UX will connect into customer experience in different ways. Similarly, business is a super broad word, and so I think the initial way to think about it is the business model. Does your company have a business model? What is the business model? Is it transactional? Is it subscription? Is it some sort of consumption? These are the ways to really think through how a company is sustainable and makes money. If it's an open source project, I'll touch on that a little bit later. There are some nuances there, but this is really kind of first and foremost from a company perspective. Just some quotes to get us started. I did think about doing this entire thing with just pictures of Vietnam and quotes, but that felt more like an inspirational talk, and hopefully this is slightly more helpful. This one I like to use from Satoshi. This is a really important one for us to think about. We don't wait for perfection. We don't wait for everything to be done. We need to work iteratively. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And sometimes the other expressions you hear on this one are things like, perfection is the enemy of the good, and that, or something like done is better than perfect. And so different people have voiced this in different ways, and Satoshi also had that sort of perspective. Another one I love, just of course because I'm a big fan of Satya, is this one around strategy requires choices. And so this idea that trade-offs are real, and that we'll cover a little bit more. And then lastly, a really nice one, this is actually a Catholic leader of a few different large nonprofits in different places, and her line was simply, no margin, no mission. You simply can't achieve your mission without margin, without a sustainable business model to that. And so it's a pretty strong challenge to quite a few things. Trade-offs, this is really one of the key things to start off with in product or any discussion. Again, I won't say it's just product. This is going to be true in engineering. It's going to be true in your business models. It's going to be true in your customer experience. Simple things like, oh, are we going to support this device or all these devices? Are we going to operate in this way or this way? We're going to have this type of business model or this type of, all of these turn into trade-offs that affect other parts of your business, product, teams, etc. And so I think that's an important one just from a way that we think about different questions or problems through the space. So getting back to a couple practical tools, this one is not an answer. This is more just an example of some of the things we use at Swan. Hopefully this helps to initiate just some thinking or some ideas or some discussion later. First, as we work on customer experience, we're big fans of jobs to be done. This is one that Block also uses quite a bit. They have some very good writing on it. I'll talk about that in a second. Some people really like user stories. If you come out of a different background, that might be something that's unique. Other things like service design, if you come from more of a design background. Any of these are okay. The main thing is just pick one, start using one, see what works, see what doesn't work. Again, iterate in the same way that you would iterate in a product. We're also working on ShapeUp. Other people often use Scrum, Agile, etc. ShapeUp is one I really like from the Basecamp team. Really helps to kind of slow things down, give enough time to build, but also do some really thoughtful work for that. And lastly, then, value prop design is one I'm a big fan of. Lots of questions that come out. I'll show that in a second. And then Lean Canvas, of course, is another little great tool. And then throughout all of this, we use Whimsical. I don't know who uses Whimsical here. Anyone? Anyone? Just a great little beautiful tool. Works super fast for diagram, process diagrams, architectural diagrams, flow of funds. There's all sorts of things that you can quickly do there, and that's a great one. A little bit further, jobs to be done. This is an example of the type of work. So the idea is, what job is your customer hiring you to do? And not at like an Uber product level, just like within this specific thing. So this is an example from one of the designers on our team found this one. The dashboard, the word dashboard comes from this part of a carriage or wagon at the time of horses. And so if you break this down, I want to do something. I want to achieve something when, so that, without. So it's a way just to kind of structure how to think about that. And so here's an example of why it's important to think about what was that dashboard hired to do. It was to keep mud off of you while you're moving in the wagon. Like, it's just very straightforward. There's a history there, and of course, this is shared later, so you can link to all these a bit later. So that's jobs to be done. Shape up, this is a really simple structure. It basically takes us kind of a 2 weeks shape up, meaning to prepare, shape things, decide what you're going to build, and then 6 weeks of really focused time to build production code. And then you roll into a cool down, which is also your shaping for the next cycle, and that. And so you end up having these slightly longer period of time than a really like sprint type idea. But also this time in the middle, both for planning, for prep, but also for cool down, so you can work on things in between. And so this is one that we're really working to adopt. Takes some time to adopt anything, of course, but a good one that I really like. And there's a great little Notion template if anybody's using Notion. These templates are open source on the web. You can download these and just start using them today. Value prop design, this is another one. I took some of the content there, threw it into Whimsical, and then what that really is both combining jobs, gains, pains, et cetera, their structure, but a whole bunch of questions that a team can work through. And this is one of the ways that we do this is running this as a 30-minute section in each of these with little sticky notes in Whimsical over Zoom. And so these are the types of things that work really well in a distributed virtual team. What happens in an early stage can shift, obviously, as you get closer to launch, as you get closer to a go-to-market. And so these are the types of activities that a product manager would start to shift into toward the end. And that could, again, depend on if you're working with sales, marketing, engineering. All of these things are the types of things that can happen there. Again, this doesn't mean it has to happen in a product function. It just means someone at your company or your project is probably fulfilling these in some way across different teams. A couple more things, questions. This is one to think through a little bit. Often product manager will hear this question from a lot of people. Can we build X? What's the answer? Of course we can. But should we build X? Why would we build X? Who's going to use X? Who's going to be willing to pay for X? When do we build X? Like, there's so many questions that come out of this question. And so being able to have that conversation, hopefully nicely most of the time, of what questions do you ask in return so that you have the right conversations at your company or your team. Another one is why. If any of you are fans of some old music in the US, this was a group that asked why a lot. And so why? What are the 3 whys that you might ask? And this is really just a great thing for any conversation beyond product discussions. Why is this important? Why would we use this? Why? Who is, like, just ask why 3 times and you'll have a much richer conversation. Lastly, then, back all the way to the janitor point, there's this idea around being helpful. And so really, the most important thing a product manager can do is really be helpful to an engineer, be helpful to a designer, be helpful to a customer so that their product can come to life for them. And so this idea of how to be helpful, it doesn't mean you have to do that specific thing, of course, but the question is what helps the conversation and what helps to get to the next thing. All right, taking a little bit turn, what's unique about product? So a lot of that was general. You could see a lot of that, just common things for any type of company. Product in a Bitcoin company, one of the things is open source culture. So many of you, show of hands, who comes from an open source culture? Anyone? Most of you? Okay, maybe not. Okay, great. So a lot of people tend to come from an open source culture in a Bitcoin project. And what that means is really being used to contribute kind of what you want, to what you want, when you want, however you want. And that's not bad. That's open source. That is a community. That is the value and power of an open source community. That's kind of tough to deal with when you're in a commercial context, trying to build a product, trying to ship something to a customer, to get to a launch date, to make money. Like, that's a pretty different context. And so being able to kind of work through that culture, how do you embrace a bit of that open source culture and at the same time be disciplined as a company, as a team? And that's not always easy. Rough consensus is another one that you might see in Bitcoin companies, partly because of the consensus protocols. This term actually came in late 90s out of the Internet Engineering Forum, and they were really working through early stages of the internet, or depending on how you define the early stages of the internet, they were working through the internet, really thinking through how to get to a decision. And rough consensus is that idea of leaving enough space for discussion, but at some point, there's sort of a decision point in a group that says this is kind of the direction that we're going to go. And so that's really what we try to implement internally. It's one is, look, there's enough time for people to discuss. We used to call it wallows at Microsoft. Like, just let people kind of work through stuff. But at some point, a decision is made, we decide on a direction, and then we start working toward that direction. One more, of course, is proof of work. It would be remiss not to have this on a Bitcoin company slide. This is very common. You'll see this come up in conversations. Just what does proof of work look like in any type of project or function? And so making sure that individuals are showing that, teams are showing that. This is really kind of earning your way into something at times within these companies. Quick aside, there's a really great team that's been forming in a very open source way called the Bitcoin product community. I'm not a major piece of this, but I'm a participant in that. That's a Discord group. They just launched some more formally, I think on Monday of this last week, the 20th, if I'm not mistaken. There's a Twitter handle there to follow. If you're interested in this topic, if you're interested in the community, that's a good one to follow. Join the Discord group, and a lot of resources there that they've spent time putting together for the community. Design is another one, so there's an important one to highlight there on another community. I'm going to take a bit of a pivot. If you're interested in product management, this is a little bit of sort of just a way to think through a bit of career direction. If you're hiring product managers or you're building out a product team, this is also something to clearly think through a few things. First, I'll say I come from a very cross-functional background, whether it was finance, marketing, sales, operations, sales leadership, just all of these things really play into this conversation. And so you'll see some people who come through a very different path. And so I think it's important to recognize that and kind of think through it. Like Bitcoin, PMs are very multidisciplinary. Typically, they'll rely on some form of core or foundation. Often they'll be engineers, or they come from UX and design. Sometimes they'll come from other backgrounds, but the point is simply that people will come into product not really from product. Very few people will start a career in product and only do product. And I personally am biased against that. I think it's much better to have a mix of functions before you come into this. But there's lots of other functions. Some people come into it more from analytics, operations, customer service, or other types of things. And so that's ways to think about that. So if you personally are looking at this or you're in these communities, really think about what is your core? What was your background that you build on to get into this? And what project or product or team or company does that fit best into? If it's sales and marketing, then you're probably going to be in a commercial project versus an open source project. If you're more from a UX background and the open source project does not have someone from a UX background, a product manager there with a UX background could make a lot of sense. And so these are also ways to think about hiring. Depending on which PM you're hiring for which product, you really need a different type of person for that team based on already who is the team that's there and what is the work that they're trying to do. A couple more things, and I'll wrap up here. I'm kind of shift into Q&A if we have any additional reading. This was really set up just to be an overview of this, but also to touch into some of these topics. And so this is all listed as additional things. The article I talked about from Matt, Shape Up, is a really important one. That's available for free online. You can find that from the Basecamp team. You can read the entire thing online. You can also look at some of the Notion things I talked about. I wrote a blog post about some of the principles at Swan and why I care so much about Bitcoin in retirement accounts for Americans. It's a very important topic as we think about adoption in the US and in other countries. And then the history of jobs to be done. There's a long history of research that got to where we are today with jobs to be done, including some work by Clay Christensen, and so you might appreciate that. And then lastly, if you're looking at the space or you have jobs to hire for, unbiased, of course, biased opinion on Bitcoiner jobs, please list your jobs there. We love to see Bitcoiner companies listing their jobs there. If you're looking for a job in Bitcoin, Bitcoiner jobs is also the place to look. With that, you can connect with me or the product team community that I mentioned online. That's my Twitter, LinkedIn, and Nostr QR code for those of you who are progressing off of Twitter onto other platforms. And with that, thank you very much. Open to Q&A if we have time.
Hello. Hello. All right, we got a question from the front row here.
Thank you. So I've experienced that pricing often jumps between different departments. Nobody knows. I'm of the belief that pricing should be of the product department. How do you guys think about it?
Yeah, I would agree with you. Lots of things can move between functions, clearly. And so pricing is one I think it really depends on the rest of the makeup of the team. If you have a strong finance lead, if you have a strong sales lead, generally I think pricing fits there. If you don't have those, and you have a really good analytics PM who understands the market and customers and competitors and so forth, pricing probably could fit there. And so I think it's an incredibly contextual answer. I don't think it's a philosophical, like, it has to be this way.
Good question. I guess to add on to that question, is that because the designer should dictate the value of their work to the customer as opposed to the sales department or marketing department to actually know what the market is, or?
So when you make the decisions of what to develop, you need to know what money you're going to make of it one way or another, or if it has a marketing value. So you need to somehow price what you're developing. Yeah, that's why I think about it that way. I have an add-on question, but I think maybe somebody else has. Yeah, I'll let somebody else ask first.
The other thing I'd say, Lucas, to build on that is, I think the market research or the market understanding should absolutely be had by the product team. Meaning, what's the potential, when you do market sizing or you do potential, you all do those types of things, TAM, whatever you want to call it, that kind of work needs to be done really product and others, ideally with a finance team if you have one. If not, it's in product. Pricing, the reason I think it depends is there's a lot of external changes to pricing that it can affect pricing. The opportunity really is the thing that probably you start with to make the decision to build. Pricing could be impacted month on month by any change in the market. And I think it's a longer conversation, but yeah, that's great. Good one. Thank you.
Okay, another question, and the gentleman in the hat.
Can you? Yeah, great presentation. Thank you so much. At what stage do you think that founders should start thinking about product management as separate from the company? So you're a man in a garage with a couple of buddies building some stuff, you get traction, and now there is an external construct of product management. So is there some early signals that you kind of leading indicators that you are ready for a product management? Because if you do it too early, it's bad from a speed perspective. If you do too late, then it's bad from building to the potential of the company.
100%. So early on, I would say it's not even needed, right? Like that is what a CEO founder should be doing, a lot of that. Practically, I'll answer it in a few ways. Practically, when there's pain, it's probably time. And a founder or a CTO generally will get to that point and they'll know, like they'll just feel it, like, I shouldn't be doing this anymore, right? And so that's one way to think about it. You could approach it proactively with jobs to be done and just like, hey, do we even need this, right? ShapeUp was actually written not with any product managers at all. ShapeUp could be run by engineers and designers. And so if engineers and designers can do that themselves, great, do it, right? But not needed, like great. Personally, for me, practically, I generally say if I don't have at least 2 engineers and a designer, I don't need a PM yet. Like that is needed first before you really think about a PM. Now, someone could think about it differently. They could say, well, I need a PM to do all the work that Lucas talked about. I need a research. I need to understand the market. I need to decide what we're going to build. I need to decide. Well, that's different. Then maybe you want to have one early. But I would put in the engineering resources first and every day and Sunday. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Jeremy, for the presentation. So there's an accepted spectrum of kind of integration of product management into everything else the company is doing, and the spectrum goes from small startups, like the whole team is like 2-3 co-founders, and they're super integrated. They can understand processes like all the product management and development processes, but they're free to depart from them, and they can like pivot 5 times within a sprint, something like that, and all the way to a huge corporation like Microsoft, where Microsoft is like better than most, I guess, but everything is slow and the departments are all separate, and even if it's not waterfall model, then it's kind of disjointed. So that's the accepted spectrum. Then somebody like Elon Musk comes and he is like an iconoclast. He's like, okay, everyone is wrong, fire everyone who's not coding. And he's still getting flack for doing that at Twitter, but if you look at SpaceX, he kind of managed to do that like ideology of every engineer is a chief engineer and they have access to everything. There can be no seams between departments. Everything has to be integrated or the product falls apart in the air. So it's very difficult because of course he is like maybe exceptional and he manages to attract and hire exceptional people, but at the scale he's doing that, it seems like maybe, like what do you feel when you listen to his like crazy interviews? A lot of them are about product management and yeah.
Yeah, first I think product management at a company that puts people into space or things into space is very different than product management at a software startup, right? Like, or any software company. I think sometimes what is said publicly is probably not how things actually operate. And so if you're building airplanes or rockets, there's a lot to that. I mean, I trained as a mechanical engineer and never practiced it beyond a summer, but it's like there's a lot that goes into that. There's no way every person is operating kind of by themselves as you build a rocket or an airplane. I hope not. Otherwise, well, anyway. The spectrum is there, absolutely. And so I think that's back to the point. This isn't that's probably something I should have said. This is an evolving thing, like just that early stage, later stage, that's part of it. Early stage company, it's probably not needed. As you get further along, it's absolutely needed. Like, that will be felt as you go through it. Yeah, I think some of those statements probably are just like the identity that he wants to portray. I don't know him well. I don't watch a lot of his things, so I can't comment further.
Awesome. One last question here. Gentleman in the front.
Koji's in the back. Since you've had
yeah,
two,
I let Koji go.
I'm going to call an audible against you, Lucas. Sorry.
So regarding product management in Bitcoin, I see some product managers from other fields come to Bitcoin and they just make a terrible job sometimes. They just don't understand how it works. And is there anything you can provide as kind of concrete examples that you've come across and something that makes product management in Bitcoin special, in your opinion, or difficult?
It's certainly difficult.
Yeah, what kind of issues, concrete issues have you come across?
Yeah, I think the one that I had about open source and rough consensus, I think that is the challenge. And so for someone to do it well, they need to figure out how to navigate that. So how do you work with people who are relatively independent at the same time, like it's going to be building relationships with the teams, building relationships with individuals, kind of work, how are you going to work through that? That's just part of working in a team. That's part one. The other piece then is the janitor one is real. And so like, I think a lot of it is also just how the person will operate in that context. If it's not helpful or if it can't be a way to kind of, and it's cliche, but like a PM needs to be a servant leader. Like they're there to help the team get things done, but they're there to help, right? Like they're not writing code. And so, but at the same time, like if you can't get the resources aligned to what you're trying to do, no one is successful. And so that's why I think that janitor one is probably the one. If you had somebody new, like go through it paragraph by paragraph, go through some of this, like those are the types of things to work through together.
Awesome. Good answer. Good question. All right, guys. We'll wrap it up here with Jeremy. Give him a round of applause.